Okay, we're going to move on now to Ambassador Ron Neumann, a distinguished ambassador with great experience in the field in this particular area. He's going to tie some of this together, and then we will move on to you and take your questions and comments. Ambassador?
I will try. Tie it together or just raise your confusion to a higher level of detail. I'm not sure which. You know, if Tibor keeps calling us experts long enough, I might come to believe it. But I am reminded that I've been at this a long time. I'm not sure that's the same thing. But I remember at one point I was at a party in Maryland when a son of Masoud Barzani, the Kurdish leader, was studying in the States, and somebody brought him up to introduce him to me and said, "Do you know Mr. Neumann?" He said, "Oh, yes, he knew my grandfather." And dear God, that was 20 years ago. It may just mean we don't have any new ideas. Well, I want to try to take a corner of this messy subject we've been talking about, which is basically the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, of the Arab Peninsula. Because Saudis get mentioned a lot with usually little explanation of what they're about, and the rest are almost completely ignored, except that people think they're all the same because they all kind of look like they're wearing the same clothes. They're actually quite different from each other and all don't always get along well. I want to try to touch on very quickly why we have interest there, what the situation is partly as they see it, what this reflects on U.S. policy now, and a few words about how one might think about policy going forward, which whoever the next president is, he or she is going to have to deal with it. I'm just going to skip interests. I'm going to just assert. We have oil interests, we have bases, we have allies that have been critical in military confrontations over 20 years, and those are all things worth preserving. Anybody wants to dispute that, we'll come back, and I won't take more time for it right now. What is going on in the peninsula is quite different in a way, because the Gulf monarchies, frankly, are hanging together. Monarchy in this day and age looks like, you know, you still have one of those? Haven't they gone away? Won't it go away soon? Well, they were all counted out in the 1960s when Arab nationalism came in. Nasser, Ba'ath Party, all those regimes have been overthrown. Gulf monarchs are still trucking along, and partly padded by a great deal of oil income. But also because while they are certainly not democracies by any way, shape, or form, there has been a certain measure of consensus, and they are also family enterprises, not just one person with a lot of rich relatives hogging the trough, but with much deeper ties in the community. And they, while they have a lot of disagreements, have been clear in their own minds that they have to hold together. And so you saw them all grouped together when Iraq invaded Kuwait. You see them all grouped together, for instance, when they feel that there's a threat to the Bahraini monarchy. Saudis, the UAE sent troops in to help. You can like or dislike the repression, but they stuck together. It is also one of the reasons, by the way, that when some of the human rights types say we should tell the Bahrainis we'll move our base if they don't do whatever we want for democracy and human rights, aside from the fact that we probably don't have the 10 or 20 billion readily available to rebuild the base, it is frankly impossible that any of the other Gulf states are going to invite us to have an alternative place. That many of them have given us basing facilities extensively in the Gulf. But by God, they're not going to offer us an alternative so we can pressure one of their own to something that they think is a short road to oblivion. So they have clearly manifested they're going to hang together. And they may understand, you know, that famous phrase of Benjamin Franklin's, we must hang together lest we all each hang separately. They got that. But they're afraid. They're scared. They're afraid. They see the world they've dealt with for most of their lifetime in chaos. Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, what's gone on in Egypt. They don't see any of these movements as having improved anything aside from its threat to themselves. They will also say, you know, who's better off now that you had all these rebellions? Not to mention a few that you guys in the States helped. So they're not much impressed with our arguments for reform. And now they feel enormously threatened by Iran. Now, this again is an historical thing, particularly when one talks about the Bahrainis, United Arab Emirates, and the Saudis. They have been afraid of Iran ever since I've worked in the area. British East India Company froze some of those disputes in the 1850s when they put down piracy in the Gulf. But this fear, which has often been exaggerated, of Iran on the Arab side, is now even greater. It was already, when I went back 2008, was already bigger than when I left in 2004, and now they fear that the nuclear deal will somehow unleash the Iranians. And there's a mixture here. It's one of the hardest things to deal with because they're really, really convinced of this. Some of their fears are justified, and many of them are exaggerated, but it means that you don't get to have a simple no, you're wrong, which would be a much easier argument to have than an argument about, well, it's a little less than you think here and, you know, different there. But that level of fear, I think, leads them to overreaction sometimes. But now they see, particularly in Iraq and Syria, they see a Shia government, dominated government in Iraq. It's not Iranian-dominated at all, but it is heavily influenced. But they see this web, in their view, spreading with the Iranian volunteers in Syria as well, linking up with Hezbollah. Much, much larger populations than they have, and much more willing to die. And it scares them. It may be exaggerated. Some of it is definitely exaggerated. Now they see Russia coming into Syria. They see Russia playing an active military role in the Middle East, which they've not seen in 40 years. And then their view is the U.S. is just backpedaling. And that isn't a new view for them. It began in the early part of the Obama administration. It was much reinforced when we talked about red lines in Syria and then did not enforce those red lines. You cannot get away from that discussion in the Middle East. And to understand that discussion, you have to understand the United States has been a pillar of stability. You can argue whether it was good or bad, but it's something everybody could count on. And we're so big and we're so powerful that whether people like us or dislike us or have mixed feelings, they orient their policies in part on what they think we're going to do. When they don't know what we're going to do, then they guess, they make assumptions. Some of those lead to bad assumptions. Some of them, if people are, in case of Russia, it may lead eventually to pushing someplace where we don't back up, where we could really be in trouble. In the case of our people who've been our friends and allies, they're not sure they can depend on us anymore. They don't have a replacement, but they grope and scrape around for arrangements, most of which are somewhat unsatisfactory. So, in this messy situation, the U.S. current lack of clarity is a real problem. It's a problem, first of all, because it is destabilizing. It leads people to make all kinds of decisions, some of which are risky, some of which may, in the end, lead to conflict. It also means that it's very difficult for us to talk to anybody and bring them together on any particular political point of view. So in Syria, you've got Saudis helping one group, you've got Qataris helping some others, you've got Turks we're probably more interested in overthrowing Assad than in getting rid of the Islamic State. You got the Jordanians who are scared stiff that their state's going to come apart, and then there are a few others. Well, if we, as the United States, want to destroy the Islamic State, which I think we have good reason to want, we have to think in terms of how do you stabilize Syria, not how do you just bomb a big hole in the ground that leaves a political vacuum for the same intellectual impulses to fill up with somebody else. We've already got Islamic State as the descendant of Al-Qaeda. We don't need a third generation because we have no political vision. So if you want to weld these disparate anti-Islamic state forces together, you're going to have to talk to them about their own interests and what our vision is, and you're going to have to try to find some meeting ground that may not be perfect from our point of view or from theirs, but that can wield us all together into a far more potent force. If we cannot, as we presently cannot, sketch out any such vision at all, we have no starting point. We just have conversations to share views and tell other people, why don't you do it like us? Particularly ineffective at a point when they're losing faith that we'll do anything at all anyway. As you could tell, I'm out of the government. So as a new administration comes in and looks forward, it's not going to find any simple answers. There are no bumper stickers here. And the level of debate we're having is not particularly edifying. But we're going to have to start from a couple of points. One is we need to think about what are our interests. And that's not so easy. So, for instance, when you get into this discussion of Iran, we've worked with Iran in Afghanistan. We have overlapping interests in Iraq and conflicting interests in the same country, because we have an anti-Islamic State interest in common, and we have an interest in a state which is not completely Shia-dominated that's at part. We have conflicting interests in Iraq. And then we have a mix of how one evaluates things in the Arab Gulf. We have interest in oil. We have interest in stability. There are certain places we probably need to have red lines. But we need to have a discussion of those interests among ourselves. We need to involve the American people in that discussion. We do a very poor job these days of explaining policy to the American people. In fact, we've really lost the distinction between strategy and policy. People continually say, what's your strategy in Syria? Strategy is how you get to a goal. When you don't have a goal, you can't have a strategy. And we have a public discussion that doesn't know the difference. So we need to separate that. And then we need to explain to people that we have multiple interests. And they're multiple valid interests. It's not about, oh, just get your priority. Can't you get your priorities straight? No, because you have more than one. Egypt's a simple example. We have a huge interest in preserving the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty that's kept Egypt out of a war with Israel for 40 years. We have a huge interest in keeping the Suez Canal open for oil and commerce because it would affect the health and well-being of the American people if it went south. And we do have an interest in democracy because the American people keep insisting that we do, and you can't really get unstuck from it even if, yeah, I think it's a valid interest, but even if you don't, you probably can't get unstuck from it in our politics. Well, you can't say it's oil over everything, let the peace treaty go to hell. You can't say we're just going to scrap democracy because the American people won't let you pursue that policy indefinitely. So it's a question of moving multiple interests forward, trying to keep them from bumping into each other and colliding. But if you don't explain that to people, then you're always issuing these bumper sticker policies about democracy and then being condemned for being a hypocrite when you can't have just one policy. So we are going to have to focus down on our interests. We're going to have to focus down on what kind of stability in Syria we want and what kind of resources we want to have. That's a very long discussion, and I've gone over my time, but I hope to kind of open up your thinking to the kind of discussion we're going to have if we're going to have sensible policies. And that means the kind of responsible discussion we're going to want our leaders to have, whoever those leaders may turn out to be less than a year from now. Thank you.